Hello, everybody, and welcome to Just Mitch Movies, the podcast. I am your host, Mitch Fesser. Grab your popcorn and your soda, for the show is starting. This is the first episode of this podcast, so it's going to be an introduction and a first film memories for myself. I've been in love with films since the first Toy Story was released in 1995. I was about a year and a half. I was born in 93, and that was the first film that I watched continuously, along with other Disney films like Peter Pan, Dumbo, Bambi. Those films were one of the first ones that I watched continuously and religiously. I mean, what other kid didn't watch Disney films growing up? And I was able to watch those with like my mom and my older sister, who wasn't really a big movie fan growing up, my older sister. But for me, films, they weren't really an escape or a huge part of my life. See, when I was younger, I was outside a lot. I grew up in the country. I grew up on a farm. I had a lot of dogs and cats, a lot of sports stuff for me to do. So for me, films were just basically something to do on a rainy day, or if I had nothing else to do outside, like if my chores were done, didn't really have a lot of animals to play with. It wasn't a sports time of the year because I played soccer, baseball, and basketball. It was really, movies were just basically something to pass the time if there was nothing else to do, or if it was time for me to go to bed. Movies for me didn't really start to be more of an escape really until I saw the first Spider-Man film directed by Sam Raimi in 2002. That was, for me, I was 8, I think. Yeah, I was 8 years old, and it was after my first communion in second grade. Yeah, I went to a Catholic school when I was younger, and that really helped out my self-esteem, that's for sure. And we got to the theater. It was me, my mom, a bunch of other people. We got to the theater, and I had been to the movie theater multiple times before this, so this was not new. I knew what to expect with the movie theater. And I remember seeing the trailer for Spider-Man. I saw the trailer for The Lord of the Rings, which that is a movie that I will discuss on this podcast. So it's part of a franchise, and I do love me some Lord of the Rings, so definitely keep your ears open for that. But anyway, we got to the movie theater, and I knew right away this movie was going to be a big deal because Spider-Man was so popular around that time. He still is, but at the time, like, this was the first time anybody could see Spider-Man swing on webs on the big screen. So we got there, and the movie theater was packed, and I loved it so much, and I knew, like, this was going to be a big freaking movie, and I just loved it. And to me, that was my first taste of how films, they can be an escape for a lot of people, their artwork for a lot of people, even though, yes, this was a superhero film, more mainstream and blockbustery, but to me, the movie wasn't really that, because everybody wanted to see this movie. It was a movie that needed to happen and needed to be seen on the big screen. So that was my first taste of how movies can be a big impact on not just my life, but everybody's lives. And that's really the main goal of this podcast, is really how movies can be such an impact on everybody's lives, myself included, as I'm such a big movie fan and have always been since seeing Toy Story, the first one, way back in 1995. So really, I've been a movie fan for pretty much almost 30 years. After Spider-Man came out, I started talking with my mother and my grandparents about like other style and genre of movies. My mom was more into horror films such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. She was really instrumental on how films can be scary, and they always have been ever since way back in her time. I mean, she remember seeing those movies in theaters, and she still gets scared of them, and she's in her 50s now, and even after she's seen them so many times, she always watches them, and she always gets scared, and it cracks me up sometimes. But I grew attached to some horror films, but I'm not as attached to those movies as she is, but I still appreciate them for what they are, so there's those. But one genre of films, I don't want to really call them genre of films, but they're just the type of films, but my maternal grandparents, so these are my mom's mom and dad. These two, I wouldn't really necessarily call them big movie buffs. My grandmother is, but my grandpa, he just watches them just to help him fall asleep. But he does appreciate a good film when it comes to story and not really much visual effects, but he appreciates films that really makes the audience think. So I appreciated that from him. He was the one that really, my grandfather, he was the one that really got me hooked on classic films like The Godfather. He actually, not just The Godfather, but he introduced me to Superman, the Christopher Reeve movie back in the 1970s, directed by Richard Donner. So my grandfather he was the one that pointed out that films can really make the audience think and see how they don't have to be big blockbuster films in order to get audiences' attention. They can really be more story-based because, I'm sorry, The Godfather, it's not your prototypical blockbuster film. I mean, yeah, at the time it was big and everybody saw it, but the movies that I remember him talking about, not just The Godfather and Superman, but he was also talking about some westerns, and I'll get to those in a second. But The Godfather to me was my introduction to classic films. And my dad, speaking of western films, he was the one that got me introduced to western films like Dances with Wolves. And he was actually also really big into sports movies at the time, so he would show me like Remember the Titans, Field of Dreams. Field of Dreams was really big in my house. And he was also big into really weird comedies. So like there were like Tommy Boy and a few Adam Sandler films. My dad wasn't a big movie watcher. He was more so a sports watcher, which is fine. And I always appreciate a good sports, but to me, I could never really watch a film with my dad unless it was like a big comedy film. Like I remember we would watch The Burbs with Tom Hanks. So it was such a bad movie, but I always enjoyed watching those comedies with my dad. Once I became introduced to the classic films, that's when I noticed that films were they're an artistic form of storytelling and an artwork overall. So this podcast, this is meant for all listeners of all lovers of film. This podcast is going to be open to all genres, whether it's superhero films, classic films, musical films, comedies. I'm going to talk about them all. And not just as a means of like a review style, but I want people to listen as I discuss so many different types. You know, I'm going to talk about the franchises. I'm going to talk about the trilogies. I'm going to talk about big movies that people always talk about. I already have ideas lined up for future episodes, and I'm so excited to talk about them. But I want people to also understand that it's not just about mainstream blockbusters. I mean, yeah, now, you know, you got big production companies all around, they're wanting to make big box offices, especially now after the writer and actor strikes. You got to make it till 2025 is their quota for this year. And you also have a lot of streaming films that have been coming out that not a lot of people are used to nowadays, but I just genuinely believe that there's not just mainstream and blockbusters. Don't get me wrong, I love the blockbuster films. I'll go see all the blockbuster films. I've already got my ticket for Deadpool and Wolverine. I'm so excited. I'm going to see all those Marvel films that are coming out next year. I'm going to be one of the first people in line to see the new Superman directed by James Gunn. So don't get me wrong, I am one of the biggest nerds out there. But I'm also one person that always appreciates good storytelling and those Academy Award films that that they're either Oscar bait or they're genuinely made to be the best film that they can be. I always appreciate films like Moneyball or Hugo, directed by Martin Scorsese. Who would have thought that Martin Scorsese, director of big mafia films like Goodfellas and Casino, would direct a classic, beautiful film such as Hugo in 2011 about a kid. And that's what I want people to be invited to with this podcast. I want people to understand that, yes, and we're going to talk about the blockbuster films. Those are going to be the first couple episodes. But I also want to listen to the movies that really touches everybody, not just me. I want people to understand that there are films out there for everybody, and I want them to understand that these films have such great impacts on everybody around. So, yeah, as I continue this podcast, I hope everybody comes into it in an open mind. There's going to be a few films that a lot of people are going to disagree with me on how it is portrayed or how good it is. And this podcast is not going to be a review-esque. It's basically just going to be discussions about what's a good movie, what's a bad movie, or it's going to be like film history. And there's also going to be an episode where I'll also discuss the box office for the week. So that'll be that. But that's mostly going to be at like the end of the episode or the beginning, just to get it out of the way. And also there's going to be like movie news, what's going on, like what films just started filming, what's my anticipation level for that movie. Like, I'm just going to throw out an example, like Deadpool and Wolverine's coming out in July. My anticipation for that film is through the roof. It's going to be so good. I've already got the ticket. I'm ready to go. Can't wait. Let's fucking go. When it comes to other discussions, once it gets to award seasons, I'm not going to predict, but I'm going to discuss like the maybe possible nominees or possible winners. So that's going to be an option to listen to later on. But overall, like, this podcast is made for all film lovers. We're going to talk about films. We're going to talk about TV shows too. And who knows, there might be a few other things discussed. So definitely stay tuned for that. You'll find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you can find your podcasts. Feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel also, titled Just Mitch Movies, where you'll also find this podcast as well as my movie and TV reviews. If you have any requests, go ahead and send me an email at mfesser10@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. So don't forget to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you all at the movies.